Hi, once again, I want to welcome you back. This is section 2 of chapter 3, the agricultural South. I failed to mention in the first video that this actually comes from the textbook, The Americans, which is the textbook we use here and in most high schools in America when covering U.S. history. Section 2, the agricultural South. The southern colonies are predominantly Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and many people include Maryland as a southern colony due to its location on the Chesapeake River. The southern colonies would be known for being a plantation economy, mainly growing cash crops, while still growing enough food to feed themselves and the servants. Fertile soil in the southern colonies would lead to a large growth of agriculture. Farmers began to specialize in cash crops grown for sale, not personal use. Long, deep rivers allow planters to ship goods directly to markets. Plantations produce most of what farmers need on their property. Few cities grow in the South because basically a farm or a plantation was its own city. With warehouses, there was no need for shops. In the South, you had a diverse and prosperous people, but not as diverse as the North. In the 1700s, many Germans, Scotch-Irish, all began to move to the South. Scotch-Irish people were people who the English had exiled from Scotland to Ireland. They were not happy there, mainly because of their Protestant religion among a Catholic country, and many immigrated to America. The southern population was predominantly small farmers. A word we use to describe small farmers is yeoman farmer. Planters are a minority but control the economy. Very few people were actually planters. Now, planters are not farmers. Planters are owners of plantations who happen to farm. A farmer has a farm, a planter has a plantation. Planters are rich, generally farmers are not. By the mid-1700s, many of these goods began to be exported overseas, and the colonies became very prosperous. You can see from this picture, you had the German settlement and Scotch-Irish. You also have a huge minority of African Americans, and in some areas, actually a majority of the people are not white. In the South, women had few legal or social rights and little formal schooling. Most women cook, clean, garden, do farm chores. Rich and poor women must submit to their husband's will. Now, again, this was not exclusively in the South. This was pretty much everywhere in the colonies at this time. There were still some indentured servants. In the 1600s, male indentured servants are 1/2 to 2/3 of the immigrants. By the 1700s, most European laborers did not come due to the reports of hardship suffered by indentured servants. As a result of not having enough indentured servants and the problems that exist in freed indentured servants, slavery really took hold in the South. Slaves are people who are considered the property of others. The English colonists increasingly unable to enslave Native Americans, therefore they turned to slaves brought from Africa. Most white colonists think at the time that Africans' dark skin justifies slavery. This is an early form of white supremacy. You had a three-way triangular trade network which tied the colonies, Africa, and the West Indies together. New England exported rum to Africa, Africa exported slaves to the West Indies, and the West Indies exported sugar and molasses to New England. The Middle Passage was a period of time when slaves were brought to America. It was a very bad route. At least 20% of Africans died from disease, abuse, and suicide on the ships. 80 to 90% of slaves, when they arrived, worked in the fields. 10 to 20% worked in houses or as artisans. Now, an artisan's a blacksmith, carpenter, things of that nature. Slaves worked full-time from age 12 until their death. Owners beat and whipped slaves who are considered disobedient and disrespectful. Life as a slave was miserable. However, the African population showed a tremendous resilience. They have different cultures and languages when they arrive, and they preserve some of their cultural heritage, especially in their crafts, music, stories, and dance. Merchants and the owners would split families, and the slaves would raise the children that were left behind. So, for instance, if you were sold and your son was left on the plantation, another slave would raise that child. The slaves resisted the subservient position on many cases and tried to escape. In 1739, you had a famous rebellion known as the Stono Rebellion. Planter families were killed, but a militia defeated the slaves. After the Stono Rebellion and later Nat Turner's Rebellion, the colonists would tighten slave laws, but slave rebellions continued. This concludes our lecture video over Section 2. Our next video will be Section 3, the Commercial North.